The sound that shattered Luca Nguyenberg's world wasn't a scream, an explosion, or a siren. It was the dry, cruel rip of heavy stock paper, a sound that cut through the respectful silence of the university art studio, a sound that vibrated straight into his bones and made every nerve ending in his body cry out in unison. The paper, which for weeks had absorbed the fine black ink from his pen, which held entire cities within its fibers, was now in two jagged pieces, dangling from the firm hands of Professor Sergei Blanc. Luca's eyes, which rarely fixed on faces, were now locked onto the professor's, and then came the word, spoken with the chilling calm of a verdict. Incapable. You are incapable of creating. You just repeat. This is not art. It's a sick obsession. Luca's world, already a place of deafening noises and blinding lights, suddenly went completely mute and dark, except for that sound of torn paper and that single word echoing in the void. How does one rebuild themselves after their entire universe is torn in half? Where are you watching this story from? Tell us in the comments. And if you believe in the power of overcoming, subscribe now so you don't miss any stories like this, showing how the greatest wounds can give rise to the most extraordinary works. To understand the depth of that tear, we must go back in time to Luca Nguyenberg's silent and complex childhood. His mother, Chiara Omar, used to say Luca was born with his skin inside out. Everything hit him 100 times more intensely. The tag on a shirt felt like barbed wire on his back. The hum of the refrigerator was an airplane engine in his ear. An unexpected hug could feel like an attack, an invasion of his personal space that made him shrink and tremble. For years, communication was a minefield. Words seemed not to reach him, or perhaps they all arrived at once, a jumble of meaningless sounds. He didn't speak, not like other children. His early years were a succession of diagnoses, of specialist waiting rooms, of pitying looks from other parents at the playground. Chiara and her husband, Ali Baker, heard it all. Developmental delay, communication disorder, even the most dreaded whisper, "Give up, he'll live in his own world forever." Chiara refused to give up. She felt there was a brilliant, sensitive mind trapped behind that wall of silence. She just didn't know the key. Frustration was a constant companion. There were days she would cry in the shower, where the sound of the water muffled her sobs, wondering where she was going wrong, why she couldn't reach her own son. She tried everything: therapies, games, music. Nothing seemed to penetrate the bubble that protected him. And then, when Luca was 6 years old, something changed. Chiara had left a notepad and a fine-tip pen on the kitchen table. She turned away for a moment, and when she looked back, Luca was there, sitting, completely engrossed. The pen in his small hand moved with a precision and speed that were almost hypnotic. He wasn't scribbling. He was building. Line by line, with infinite patience, he drew. They weren't houses, trees, or people. They were systems. Complex gears, intricate circuits, blueprints of futuristic cities with skyscrapers that touched the sky and transportation systems that defied gravity. He would spend hours, sometimes the entire day, hunched over the paper, the outside world finally silenced by the universe he was creating. Those drawings became his voice. They were his way of processing the chaos of the world and organizing it into logical, beautiful patterns. If he was overwhelmed by a loud noise on the street, he would come home and draw a sonic dampening system for an imaginary city. If the texture of a fabric bothered him, he would draw a machine that wove perfectly smooth fibers. Chiara finally understood. He wasn't absent. He was deeply present, but in a different language. The paper was his interpreter. She began collecting his drawings, storing them in thick folders. There were hundreds, then thousands of sheets, each one a fragment of her son's soul. The house filled with parallel worlds, with silent cities and perfect machines that existed only in Luca's mind and on the stroke of his pen. For Chiara, these weren't just sheets of paper. They were proof that her son wasn't empty, but overflowing. The discovery of Luca's art was like finding an oasis in the desert, but the journey that followed was far from a smooth path. The outside world wasn't ready for his language. School became the first major battleground. Chiara would attend parent-teacher meetings and hear the same refrain from well-intentioned but unprepared teachers. "He doesn't interact, Chiara. He spends the whole class drawing these things. He's not paying attention. We need him to fit in, to participate in group activities." They saw the drawings not as a form of expression, but as a symptom, an escape, an act of defiance. They suggested limiting his access to paper and pens, believing that if they took away his escape, he would be forced to interact. It was the first time Chiara felt a cold, protective rage. Taking away Luca's paper would be like ripping out his tongue. She tried to explain, to show them the folders of his work, but the teachers just smiled condescendingly. It's an interesting hobby, but here he needs to learn the curriculum. Then came the phase of advice. Relatives and friends, with hearts full of the best intentions, offered solutions that sounded like sentences. "You're spoiling him too much," an uncle would say. "If he were my son, he'd have learned to behave by now." Others suggested therapies that promised to normalize Luca, to erase his quirks and turn him into a neurotypical child. They went to a renowned clinic, where a therapist with a practiced smile looked at Luca's drawings for less than a minute and declared, "Restricted and repetitive behavior. We need to extinguish this and broaden his interests." Extinguish. The word echoed in Chiara's mind like a fire alarm. They wanted to erase the only thing that made sense of her son's world. They left that clinic and never returned. Social pressure was relentless. At birthday parties, Luca would hide in a corner, overwhelmed by the noise and movement, and Chiara would see other parents exchanging pitying glances. She felt the weight of judgment, the unspoken question, "What's wrong with him? What's wrong with you?" This search for validation, for a place where Luca could be himself, generated a deep, silent pain. For Luca, every attempt to fit in was a small trauma. He would come home from school exhausted, not from learning, but from the Herculean effort of trying to navigate an environment that made no sense to him. Sometimes he would spend the entire night drawing, as if to purge the day's chaos and restore his inner order. For Chiara, the pain was one of helplessness. It was seeing her son's brilliance and knowing the world only saw oddity. She felt she was failing, that she wasn't strong enough to protect him. Her husband Ali dealt with the situation differently. He loved Luca fiercely, but his concern manifested as a need to prepare him for the real world. "He needs to learn to be tougher, Chiara. The world won't adapt to him," Ali would say on long, tense nights. It was fear speaking, the fear of a father who wanted his son to survive in a society that doesn't forgive differences. This divergence in approaches created a subtle rift between them, another layer of difficulty in their already complex reality. The false hope that one day Luca would simply wake up normal was slowly replaced by a heavy weariness, the feeling of fighting an invisible and lonely war. The peak of this conflict with the world materialized in the figure of Professor Sergei Blanc. When Luca, already a young adult, secured a place at a prestigious art academy, Chiara and Ali felt a breath of hope. Finally, he would be in a place where his unique ability would not only be accepted but celebrated. The academy was his place, or so they thought. Professor Blanc was a legend at the institution, an old-guard purist who valued classical art, visceral emotional expression, broad strokes, and a soulful brushstroke. He saw Luca's art as the opposite of everything he preached. To him, the millimeter precision, the perfect lines, and the absence of human figures in Luca's drawings weren't a style, but a flaw, an inability to connect with the true essence of art. From day one, he treated Luca with a mix of disdain and impatience. While he praised the expressive smudges of students like Jacob Moretti or the chaotic collages of Harper Johnson Leroy, he would pass Luca's desk and sigh, shaking his head. "Still with your little maps, Mr. Berg? Where's your soul in that?" The final project of the semester was themed The Inner City. For Luca, it was the perfect invitation. He spent weeks immersed in creating his masterpiece. It was a drawing on a nearly meter-long sheet, depicting a biomechanical metropolis. Each building was connected by pulsating arteries of light, each vehicle a cell moving in a perfectly orchestrated system. It was his brain on paper, a literal representation of his mental landscape, complex, ordered, and vibrant. He was proud. For the first time, he felt he had managed to perfectly translate what was inside him. On presentation day, he placed the drawing on the large central table. The other students gathered around, some marveling at the amount of detail, like Aisha Aziz Liu, who looked with genuine admiration. Then Professor Blanc approached. He walked around the table, arms crossed, his face a mask of disdain. He stood in silence for a long minute, a silence that hung heavy in the air, and then he picked up the drawing. Luca thought he would hold it up for everyone to see, but instead, he held it with both hands, and looking directly into Luca's eyes tore it in half. The sound echoed. The silence that followed was broken by his voice. Incapable. You are incapable of creating. You just repeat. This is not art. It's a sick obsession. As long as you hide behind these lines, you will never be an artist. Luca stood paralyzed. It was as if the professor hadn't just torn paper, but his own skin, exposing his brain, his soul, for everyone to see and judge. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply picked up the two pieces of his destroyed world and walked out of the room. That night the house was silent. Allie Baker, upon hearing what happened, was furious, but his anger took an unexpected turn. "Maybe he's right, Chiara," he said, his voice low and tense. "Maybe Luca needs a shock to his system. He can't spend his whole life drawing his machines." The pain of betrayal in Chiara's eyes was immense. It wasn't just the professor. It was the world. And now, even her husband, saying her son was broken. That was the lowest point. Chiara sat on the floor of Luca's room next to him as he stared blankly at the wall, the pieces of the drawing in his lap. In that moment, she made a decision. If the world wouldn't create a place for her son, she would build it herself, brick by brick. The turning point didn't happen with a grand gesture or a dramatic event. It began quietly, with late-night internet research. Chiara, her eyes burning with fatigue and tears, typed the words, "Autistic artists, detailed art, neurodiversity in art." What she found was a universe she didn't know existed. Forums, online galleries, communities of artists from around the world who, like Luca, saw the world in patterns and systems. They didn't call themselves sick or obsessive. They called themselves precision artists, visionary architects. For the first time in a long time, Chiara felt a spark of hope. It was in one of these forums that she found the name Evelyn Rahman. She wasn't a traditional therapist, but an art curator and mentor specializing in neurodivergent artists. Her bio read, "I don't teach art. I help artists find the best language for the art that already exists within them." Chiara scheduled an online consultation. The conversation with Evelyn was like opening a window in a stuffy room. Chiara recounted Luca's story, her voice catching as she described the incident with Professor Blanc. Evelyn listened patiently without interruption. When Chiara finished, Evelyn didn't offer words of pity. Instead, she said with contagious calm, "May I see his work?" Chiara turned the laptop camera and showed the walls of Luca's room, covered in drawings. She showed the folders, sheet by sheet. Evelyn was silent for a long time, just looking. Then she said, "Chiara, your son doesn't have an obsession. He has a signature. What that professor called repetition, I call a consistency of genius. He isn't hiding behind the lines. He is speaking through them." The tears Chiara had been holding back finally came, but this time they were tears of relief. Someone finally saw. Someone finally understood. Evelyn suggested a change of tools. "Paper limits the scale of his vision," she explained. "What if we gave him an infinite canvas?" The next day, a delivery arrived. A huge professional graphics tablet and a computer with the most advanced design software. Luca looked at the equipment with suspicion. He loved the feel of paper, the friction of the pen. Chiara, following Evelyn's advice, simply set it up in his room and left it there. For 3 days, Luca didn't touch the devices. He just circled them, like an animal studying a strange creature. On the 4th night, Chiara woke up in the middle of the night to a soft light coming from his room. She peeked through the door. Luca was sitting in front of the screen, digital pen in hand. What he was creating was breathtaking. The dark screen was like a universe, and he was drawing constellations, galaxies of cities interconnected by bridges of light. The zoom was infinite. He could zoom in to draw the screw on a window of a building kilometers away, and then zoom out to see the entire city as a living organism. He had found his language. The change was subtle, but profound. He no longer needed thousands of sheets of paper. His entire universe now fit into a single file, a constantly expanding world. Evelyn connected him to online communities, where he could share his work without needing to speak. Comments began to arrive, from other artists, from engineers, from architects. This is genius. The complexity is incredible. Have you thought about animating this? For the first time, Luca wasn't being analyzed or corrected. He was being seen and admired. The quiet turn wasn't Luca changing to adapt to the world. It was finding a piece of the world that already spoke his language. The small victories began to accumulate, like raindrops forming a river. The first was an email from a digital art collector in Tokyo, a man named Bruno Demir Watanabe. He had seen one of Luca's works on a generative art forum and offered a considerable sum for a high-resolution file. Chiara read the email to Luca, unsure how he would react. Luca just looked at the screen, then at his mother, and gave a barely perceptible nod. But his eyes sparkled. The money wasn't the most important thing. It was the validation. Someone, from halfway across the world, saw value in his vision, enough to want to own it. The payment was used to buy an even more powerful processor for his computer, an investment in his own universe. The second victory came through Maja Castro, the owner of a small avant-garde gallery in the city center, known for showcasing unconventional artists. Evelyn Rahman had sent her Luca's digital portfolio. Maya called Chiara, her voice full of enthusiasm. "I've never seen anything like it. It's like MC Escher meets Sid Mead. I want to exhibit his work, not printed. I want high-definition digital screens in the gallery." The opening night was a test for Luca. The venue was packed with people, soft music, and conversation. Chiara and Ali stood beside him, a protective shield. Luca was tense, wearing headphones to block out the noise, but his eyes never left the screens displaying his cities in slow, hypnotic motion. People stopped, stared, leaned in, mesmerized by the details. Chiara overheard fragments of conversations. "It's unbelievable the patience this must take. Look at the symmetry, it's perfect. It looks like a real place just from another planet." Then an elegant woman, Nina Dubois, a local art critic, approached them. She didn't address Chiara or Ali. She looked directly at Luca. "Your work isn't about cities," she said, her voice calm and respectful. "It's about the beauty of order amidst chaos. It's about finding peace in complexity. It's magnificent." Luca met her gaze for a moment, a long moment of silent connection. And then he spoke. A single word, clear and firm. Yes. It was the first time in years he had used his voice to agree with someone's interpretation of his inner world. For Chiara, that word sounded louder and more triumphant than any symphony. The gallery was open for a month, and all digital editions of Luca's works were sold. The story began to spread on art and technology blogs. The kid who draws cities was becoming a name, a curiosity, and then a phenomenon. Each small victory was a thread of light unraveling the darkness left by the tearing of that paper. As time went on, the most profound transformation wasn't the one that happened in Luca's career, but the one that occurred within Chiara. For years, she had fought for acceptance, fought for the world to understand her son. Now, watching his success, she realized the most important battle had been fought within herself. She remembered the early years, the pain and fear, the secret wish that he would be normal. She remembered crying because he didn't hug her, feeling rejected by his need for space. She realized that even in her unconditional love, there was a layer of grief for the son she had hoped for, the son who would easily fit into society's expectations. Looking at Luca now, engrossed in his screen, creating worlds that fascinated thousands, she felt a wave of clarity. The problem had never been Luca. The problem was the ruler the world, and for a time, even she herself, used to measure him. He wasn't a flawed version of a neurotypical child. He was a perfect manifestation of a neurodivergent being. His sensitivity wasn't a weakness. It was what allowed him to perceive details that escaped everyone else. His silence wasn't empty. It was a space for the concentration his art demanded. His need for routine and order wasn't rigidity. It was the structure upon which he built his breathtakingly complex universes. Chiara learned to find joy in the little things that had once frustrated her. She learned to appreciate the way he aligned his objects, seeing it not as a compulsion, but as an aesthetic sense. She learned to communicate in silence to understand his state of mind through the intensity of his digital pen strokes or the color palette he chose. Their relationship deepened, becoming a partnership based on mutual respect and an understanding that transcended words. Ali also changed. Seeing his son's work being acclaimed by experts, seeing the admiration in strangers' eyes, chipped away at the armor of fear that made him so rigid. He grew closer to Luca, no longer trying to change him but showing genuine interest in his process. He would spend hours watching Luca work, asking technical questions about the software, about image resolution. He became Luca's biggest fan and protector, the practical manager who handled contracts and finances, freeing Chiara to be the emotional safe haven. The family, once marked by tension and fear, found a new equilibrium. They were no longer a family fighting autism. They were a family celebrating Luca's unique mind. True acceptance, Chiara understood, wasn't tolerating difference. It was recognizing it as a form of beauty and genius. Luca didn't need to be cured. The world was the one that needed to learn to see. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, in an email with the official crest of the Louvre Museum. It wasn't spam. Chiara had to read it 3 times to believe it. The curator of the Contemporary Art and New Media Wing, Jules Thompson, was organizing an exhibition called Architectures of the Future, the Digital Vision. He had encountered Luca's work through an online publication and was fascinated. He was inviting him to be one of the main artists of the exhibition, with a central installation dedicated to his work, the Louvre. The name resonated with the weight of centuries of art history. The place where the Mona Lisa rests wanted to exhibit the futuristic cities of her silent son. The irony was so thick, it could almost be touched. The journey to Paris was surreal. Luca, with his headphones and a tablet, was calm, as if he were going to the local gallery. For him, the prestige of the place was less important than the quality of the screens they would use. The installation was spectacular. A dark room with 3 walls covered in giant screens, displaying a panoramic animated version of his most complex city, biomechanic metropolis. The city lights pulsed softly. Vehicles slid through their luminous arteries. It was like being inside Luca's mind. On the opening night, the venue was packed with critics, collectors, and art lovers from around the world. Luca stood in a corner with his parents, observing the reactions. People were hushed, amazed. And then, Chiara saw him. Across the room, much older, his shoulders slightly stooped, was Sergei Blanc. He was looking at the installation with an unreadable expression. Chiara felt a chill. She didn't know he would be in Paris. Apparently, he had retired and moved there. He began to walk slowly towards the artwork, his eyes fixed on the screen. He approached, and his gaze narrowed on a specific point in the immense digital landscape. He leaned in, as if to see better. Chiara followed his gaze. There, in the heart of the metropolis, projected on one of the main towers, almost like a holographic watermark, was an image. It was a black and white drawing, with a visible tear line, perfectly reconstructed digitally. It was the drawing, the one he had ripped apart. Years ago, Luca hadn't forgotten it. He had integrated it, transformed the wound into a foundation, the symbol of his destruction into the cornerstone of his greatest creation. Sergei Blanc stood there, frozen, for a time that felt like an eternity. He didn't look at Luca. He didn't need to. The artwork said it all. It was the most eloquent and devastating response he could have received. There was no anger in it, only a fact. What you tried to destroy became immortal. Slowly, he turned and walked out of the room, disappearing into the crowd. Luca didn't celebrate. He simply observed the scene, with the serenity of someone who had finally placed the last piece in an immense puzzle. The pain of that day at the university hadn't magically disappeared. It was still there, but it no longer defined him. He had absorbed it and transformed it into art. That night, looking at the Paris skyline from the hotel window, Chiara understood the ultimate truth. Hope is not the promise that pain will disappear, but the certainty that we can build something beautiful and strong, not in spite of our scars, but because of them. Luca's world had been torn apart, but he had sewn it back together with threads of light. Talent doesn't scream for attention. Sometimes it just draws in silence, waiting for someone who has the patience to learn its language. Luca's story is a reminder that the brightest minds often flourish in the most unexpected conditions, and that true disability lies not in being different, but in failing to see the genius that difference can contain. If this story touched you, like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Someone you know, or even you yourself, might need to hear that your voice, however quiet, has the power to build universes. Share and help spread this message.